Oh, nonsense. It's the perfect length. Total freedom of movement, Steve said, as he did a few squat lunges. Unbeknownst to him, Larry had stepped out of his own changing room and was face to face with Steve from behind in that armored skirt that needed some adjusting. It feels like I'm wearing nothing at all! Nothing at all! Nothing at all! Goddess of love, I beseech thee like I've never beseeched before. Knock that vision out of my head so I don't have to gouge my eyes out. Gah! The dwarf lifted the faceplate of his armor and clutched at his eyes as Steve looked back. Oh, hey, Larry didn't see you there. New armor is great stuff, yeah? Look, they made yours even better with extra spikes. Same amount of protection, less weight. Good stuff, yeah? He said as he turned to face the room Larry had retreated into. Steve, for the love of all that is beautiful in this world, put on some pants or a longer skirt, Larry called out from inside. Fine, fine. I guess the skirt could use adjusting, Steve muttered as Fenrina and Sherry behind him began to laugh. The armorsmith just sighed and shook her head as she began to pull out a longer piece of cloth to change up his armor. You're like that one guy at the baths who uses a hand towel instead of a regular towel to cover himself. The armorsmith muttered as Fenrina and Sherry laughed harder, and Steve just muttered as he went to take the armor off and wait for it to be altered. After that, they ended up waiting around getting comfortable with their new gear until it was starting to get dark before joining up with the consul once more as the first phase of his assault was being prepared. The 12,000 or so orcish auxiliaries had been assembled at the edge of the forest, while the consul spoke to their leader and the Arbitus Council to keep everyone in the loop. As I mentioned before, we need to eliminate each advantage of the elves before the main assault. Their cavalry are better than ours for the most part. So tonight, once it's dark, First Spear Iron Wolf here will lead his men into the town around the fortress and do what orcs do best: raid. Once they've got the defenders riled up, they'll pull back using their rear guard to keep consistent contact with the enemy to guide them into the forest, where my legions will be lying in wait. Laying in wait? He asked then, and then shook his head. Whatever it is. We will draw them into the forest and then close ranks and kill as many of their horsemen as possible. Won't the orcs be run down by the faster horsemen? The Archon asked. They've got a number of wargs. Those raiders on foot will draw back first. They can sprint away quicker than the elves anyway. Consul Gary nodded. Ah, yes, the giant wolves. How did you deal with those when invading orc lands anyway? They must have been terrifying to deal with. Evelinus mentioned, but Consul Gary laughed. What? The wargs? We bred those. Orcs can't even fucking farm properly. They were living in fucking huts when we conquered them. What makes you think they'd be able to breed giant riding wolves? Gary took another moment to snort. You going to take that sort of talk? Evelinus asked the orc, then seeming more curious than anything else. Look, my father and I watched this crazy bastard order his men to build a bridge across a river we all thought was impossible to cross, and then burn it once they were on our side of the river. We were smart and joined him immediately. Now all my kids are citizens, and they got to grow up with clean water and hospitals and roads. He can say whatever he wants about my ancestors. The orc spoke with a surprisingly clean accent. Gary grinned as the orc said that and went on. Humans bred all the dogs we have today. You think we'd just try to make wolves smaller and more docile? Trust me, plenty of us wanted to make them even bigger so we could ride them. But they're really only great at sprinting, and it's hard to keep them tightly grouped like horses, so we prefer those. But they're great companions for our new orc citizens. If you don't mind having them as citizens, then why are your legions human? Evelinus countered then. Uniformity for formations. There are some orc cohorts, but most of them headed north with my co-consul. Gary shrugged. Besides, we play to strengths like I said. They make better skirmishers and raiders. Now we all know our parts. The tribunes are ready with their cohorts as well. You're confident they won't explode? He asked, looking at Steve, who nodded at first. Yeah. Then he shrugged. Probably. Hardly any of them caught fire in training, which is a good sign. But, we won't know how they respond in battle until, well, we use them. That's as good as I'm going to get, I suppose. Consul Gary muttered before nodding to Iron Wolf. Right. Get into position. Remember, set fires, make noise, but keep actual looting to a minimum. Your men need to be light for the run back. They lit the first fire. He heard the word passed on then as the orcs began their attack on the buildings outside the wall of the fortress. Once that word spread through the camp, it was like the ripple of a wave. The food was put away. The stories stopped. The soldiers rose and assembled. In the edge of the forest, they made a rough semicircle. Though the trees made it impossible for large formations, the individual units filled in the spaces between the trees, shield to shield, their spears at the ready for the cavalry they'd soon be fighting. More units were up at the western and eastern edges of the semicircle, prepared to rush out and fully surround the elves once they had been lured into the trap. "We know the drill," the orc replied before giving the consul an Almarin salute, driving his fist into his chest before extending his hand palm flat, which the consul returned. As he whistled, his orcs began to assemble and move along the tree line as they eyed the fortress across the clearing. "So, what do we do now?" Steve asked, as the consul shrugged. "I was planning on a light dinner. I don't like anything heavy before a battle." The consul's reply made Steve frown. "Wait, what? They're about to go out and attack and you're going to eat?" he asked. "It'll take them about an hour to get into position and then half an hour at least to sneak up to the village. After that, I give it an hour of raiding to give the defenders time to assemble and counterattack. So we've got around 2.5 hours before they even start coming back. It's good to have some food in you before a big fight, though you're free to do whatever you like." The consul shrugged before turning to head back to his command tent. "Wait!" Stephen called out. "That's it! We wait around in the darkness! But that's boring!" "That's how battles work. It's not like we instantly engage and then fight to the death," the consul explained as he stopped and looked back. "Once we've eliminated most of their cavalry, we start building siege engines and actually laying siege. Moving around large amounts of troops takes time. Besides, unless things go horribly wrong, I won't even be in any of the fighting." "You won't?" Steve asked next. "I'm in charge of this army. If I'm engaged in close combat, I likely did something wrong. The best thing I can do is sit back, find a place to watch things going on, and tell my runners to adjust ranks as needed. If my field officers are doing their jobs, and they normally are, then I'm hardly needed once they set my plan into motion. Now come on and let's get some dinner." As the consul and his staff began to head back to the command staff, Steve looked around at the Arbutus Council before shrugging. "This all sounds surprisingly civilized for something that's supposed to be barbaric and violent," Archchair Tyrinia mentioned, as she rubbed her hands together nervously like she normally did when confronted with conflict. "Well, he's a professional at it. I suppose we should follow his lead," the Arcanist Archibald mentioned with a shrug. The genie, with his dark skin crisscrossed with glowing runes, normally stood out in stark contrast to those around him, but he had covered up the runes and fit in with those Almarins from north of the Shattered Sea quite well. The council nodded in agreement then, as they followed after the consul to partake in his light dinner. After that they broke up, each heading to their corresponding cohort among the legions in order to prepare for the battle. Steve and the other members of Doom found themselves without a unit to attach to directly and were wandering around the camp. "It's a strange feel in the air, isn't it?" Steve remarked as they walked around the various cohorts that were spread out, waiting for the attack. It was hard for him to put his finger on exactly what was different. They weren't exactly nervous. He saw a number of centurions and other officers sharing stories about past battles, or even past trips to a brothel to get the men to laugh and focus on other things. Many of the veterans were giving their swords a final sharpening, or even stretching to prepare for the battle. But things weren't exactly relaxed either. There were men at the perimeter keeping watch, vigilant to a change in plans. The camp was tense, but focused. Steve and the others found themselves besides the consul once more and his command staff. They had horses nearby, but for now were on foot, on top of the only hill nearby. "The cloud cover is working, but almost too well. I can't see anything," Consul Gary muttered. "I can," the Archdean replied besides him. "Most of your men are in position. The orcs are in the town now. They've started to burn it, but they seem to be herding the civilians into the fortress rather than kill them." "Yes, that's part of the plan. More mouths for the defenders to feed if this turns into a drawn-out affair. The consul nodded. Speaking of what are the defenders doing? There is movement inside the walls. Soldiers are being roused. Horses are being pulled from stables, but they are far from ready. Archers are manning the walls, but your orcs aren't giving them good targets. They waited then, all watching the Archon as she stood motionless, eyes closed, watching the battle through whatever means she had at her disposal. A minute passed, 10, 20. Steve was beginning to get antsy as the stress of being so near a fight and yet unable to participate grew on him. How long had it been? How long did it take? Steve nearly jumped when the Archon spoke again. Their cavalry is assembling. Their vanguard is moving out. Runner, tell them to light the signal fire to guide the raiders back. Consul Gary spoke to a nearby soldier who quickly ran off into the dark woods. After that, things were quiet once more. With the trees before them, Steve couldn't even see the fortress or the burning town. It was too dark to even see more than a faint orange hue above the tree line. More cavalry. They are moving in earnest. I see many orcs on foot leaving the town. I see the wolves now. They're moving in packs. As one snaps at the vanguard, another pulls back. Then the third moves in and the cycle is repeated. Good. That's all as it should be, Gary confirmed. Open retreat now. Most of those on foot are in the trees. The wolves are sprinting to catch up. The cavalry give chase, but they're trailing behind. By now, Steve could see a few torches ahead of them in the woods, as the orcish raiders began to filter back into the woods. As they found the Almoran infantry, they'd brush past and then assemble on the other side, getting ready to join the fight once the elves were surrounded. The vanguard is inside the tree line. Steve strained to see, but the dark night provided him very little to work with. Soon he saw the light of elven glow globes and heard calls of surprise. That's them finding our infantry. Gary nodded. Where's the rest of the cavalry? Approaching. There is confusion among the vanguard. The rest of their cavalry have begun to enter the woods. Runners, to the flanks right now, tell them to close the circle. If some elves escape the noose, let them run, we just need the bulk. With that, 2 runners went sprinting off into the woods. Steve could hear yelling and screaming coming from before them, but still couldn't see much. He was used to his fights being filled with the sounds of magic going off and all sorts of chaos. But he was a little surprised that the sounds of battle weren't as loud now that he wasn't in the middle of it. Your ranks are closing. Some elves will escape, but most are inside the circle. Steve, flare. When Gary told him that, he quickly pulled the ingredients from his pouches, mixing them together in a jar of the purest and highest-grade arcane water he had before handing it to Fenrina, who hurled it high into the air above them. No one look at it. He warned, looking at the ground, then before a white light bloomed above them. He could see his shadow very clearly, as well as the shadows of the trees around them, as the bright flare took hold in the sky, falling very slowly back to the ground as it illuminated the battle before them. Steve could now better see the Almorans engaging the elven cavalry. The loose ring earlier had tightened up as they met with the enemy. Shields together, they used their spears through the gaps to poke and strike at the horses from a distance. They didn't provide single targets for the elves to engage, but rather walls that slowly closed in on them. Step by step, they were pushed back closer into the center. Do they really have to kill so many horses? He asked then, feeling some guilt for the animals as he saw how many were struck down in the battle. First rule of fighting a mounted opponent when you're on foot. His brother George said, get them off the mount. If you can't drag them off, then kill the mount. And it's safer to usually kill the mount. Steve frowned, but then stayed quiet as they watched. The circle was getting closed further and further before he realized something. Are any more defenders leaving the fortress? The cavalry who escaped reached them just as they were leaving the edge of the town. They're now evacuating the structures and closing the gates. I saw some riders head south, but they didn't make it far. The Archon described. Nothing I can do about them sending magic distress calls, but I was prepared for couriers, Consul Gary explained. We are blocking all magical communication attempts, Steve mentioned. So, I guess that means no reinforcements. Hopefully. They waited on the hill as the Almarins continued to close in on the surrounded cavalry. Among the trees, the elves couldn't mount an effective charge, and when they did attack at the walls of men, the Almarins would just hold fast, biding their time until the elves pulled back and then continued to close. As it got too crowded, the tighter the circle was, the men would drop back and form multiple ranks, changing out who was up front every few minutes so no one got too tired. Dead elves and horses littered the forest floor as the flare drew close to the tops of the trees, almost out of time. "How many are left?" Gary finally asked. "Between a third and a quarter," the Archon replied. "Runner, tell the ranks to hold. If they dismount and disarm, they will be taken prisoner. If they refuse, then they shall be killed, or crucified, or, no, crucified is fine. I don't have enough snakes for my other idea." Once the consul had settled on his plan, the runner ran off into the night like the three before him had. "Who thinks they're going to surrender?" he asked. "My money is they'll die to the last in some idiotic romantic notion," George mentioned. "I think they'll surrender. It's too late in the night. They'll be tired and confused," Gary countered as they both waited. "Well, I think some will surrender and some won't," Sherry said next, as the two men looked over at the half-succubus. "That's cheating," Gary protested. "It's called being realistic. Any group of people is at least 10% idiots. Assuming that 10% isn't already dead, they'll fight to the last now rather than surrender." "I like your girlfriend, Steve," the consul commented then. Thanks," Steve said, feeling rather strange about the whole affair. He didn't like hanging back and just watching other people fight. The entire time he'd wanted to rush forward and do something, but had enough presence of mind to hold back. "Flare," Gary said then, which made Steve jump a little. Once more he mixed the ingredients and handed it over to Fenrina to hurl into the sky. The group looked away as it burst, and another miniature star burned bright in the night sky. They heard some more shouting from ahead of them in the trees, but couldn't really see much now. Soon the runner reappeared, however, saluting the consul as he approached. "Sir, most of them surrendered, but a few didn't and were killed. The prisoners are being organized now, sir, and the medicae are on the field." Even before she could say anything, George and Gary were handing a few coins to Sherry. "Excellent," Gary replied with a grin, despite losing the bet. "I don't suppose you have any rough estimates on numbers yet?" He turned to look at the Archon. 15,000 cavalry are now dead or captured. Another 5 are in the fortress," she replied. "Ha! 15,000 cavalry taken out just like that? I'm sure our losses weren't so bad. Between our cavalry and the wargs, we've got them outnumbered so they can't try anything fancy. This siege is off to a very good start." He nodded, but the Archon wasn't finished. "So far I make it out to be 120,000 archers and swordsmen inside the fortress. There might be more, but I'm fairly sure that's all of them." As she said that, Steve felt his stomach lurch a little. 120? We've only got 80. Fuck! But even as he despaired, his brother just grinned. "Archers and swordsmen, Steve. So half that number is practically useless between our armor and your tribune's magic." George just laughed, obviously thinking it was good odds. "Either way, don't think this battle is over already," the Archon cautioned. "Of course not. Steve, I need you to keep the flares going all night. Runners, send word to all units, quarter watch, quarter sleep, half work," the consul commanded, and as they all went running, the Archon finally opened her eyes to turn and look at him. "What do you mean? What's going to happen now?" she asked. Now we eliminate the next advantage they have, their walls. We shall work through the night, rotating shifts, as our legionnaires get to work. And by tomorrow, our siege engines will be rolled out to start attacking them from beyond the range of even their best archers. And after that, we continue until either we are dead or their walls are draped in our banners. For as I mentioned before, we play to our strengths, and we are human. The consul looked at the Archon with a wide grin. "Which means that we never stop."